Welcome to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome to Life Behind Bars, and on today's show we're going to be talking about prison roles, and more importantly prison roles on the right side of the bars. So what we would say is not the prisoner roles, but the actual roles of prison officers, of governors, of the civilian staff, of the civic servants, and everything that goes to make up running a prison. God, I thought you were going to jump in. So, anyway, so episode 3, we're going to get straight into that. So, Officer G, you were a prison officer for 38 years. You've worked in many different establishments. You've worked in different countries as a prison officer. People might not know, but you worked in Australia. You were one of those guys on the tower with a gun.
Well, it was a part-time job, believe it or not, in the sense that,
even better.
Quite interestingly, everybody thinks it's not the American system, which really has separate armed guards to correctional officers. They're completely different services. Whereas in Australia, you were all a prison officer on the ground and you went up the towers as well. So you did both those roles. So I would come into work, and perhaps the first 4 hours of our morning, because shifts are always based on 8 hours there, I'd do the 4 hours, I'd have a 20-minute break, and then I'd go up the tower for the second half of my shift. So I did 2 roles. It was quite strange to be sort of down and involved with prisoners and then walking around a tower with a handful of weapons like pistols and shotguns. And
what was that like? Because that's so different to the UK. That obviously you've never been armed other than a baton in the UK because it's been.
No, but when I first went there, it was quite unusual to end up part of your training. They say, right, we're off down the firing range now, of course, and you trained in this. It was the Remington pump action shotgun. Yeah. That was mostly for riot problems, of course. Then you trained in gas guns because they used to gas prisoners out on the yards if they had a riot situation. They used CS gas to control crowds and stuff like that. And we also had a Smith & Wesson, which was a pistol, only ever up the tower, or when you went on escort. So if you were on an escort, you'd have to go into the armory, collect and sign for your weapon, of course, and then you'd only have one of the 2 officers would carry the weapon. Whoever was carrying the weapon was never cuffed to the prisoner for obvious reasons, and always used to walk behind them when they were going anywhere. Your job was to stand up behind just in case. And then you also had a Remington 223, not a Remington, I forgot what it's called now, a Ruger 223 a rifle up on the towers. So
I'm going to ask you a question because people are going to be sat there listening to this going, ask him.
No, I never used it.
Oh.
Never. Occasionally I walked around quite nervous because there was a few times when there was suspicion, particularly with one particularly big gangster from Sydney, really quite dangerous, powerful gangster that would have been obviously murder and gangs and stuff like that, and firearms wasn't beyond their ability to use. And there was some fear one night. We got a message. They thought they were going to try to come in towards the prison and literally take out the tower guards.
Okay, so
because it was a big open space there.
The guys with the guns, who you take out first?
Yeah, there was a big open space outside the prison at the time. There's not now because I've seen it, Googled it and seen it out. It's all been built up. But it was a big open space right down to the sea, a place called Long Bay. And so I remember that time they said, so you're going up the tower and you're supposed to come out onto the tower every so often. Well, you can imagine coming out and making yourself a lovely silhouette sitting on the top with the moons up at full. So you could find that was really quite a nervous time because these people aren't capable of doing that. So, you know. But yeah, happens. It's occasional.
What a life. And that's just the role of a prison officer in Australia.
I do remember once when there was a bit of a serious thing going on and they found out prisoners were trying to break up onto the roof space, and it wasn't me, I wasn't on the towers, but another tower officer literally came out the tower and he literally let off a few rounds around the roof to get them all back down inside. So as their heads were popping up, he'd ping a few bullets off the top of the roof space and they'd get down. It was to stop them getting onto the roof space. Yeah. Remember, if you think of Manchester,
strange ways,
prisoners, they were on the roof, and once they're on the roof and no other way of restricting that, there was chaos took place after that for a number of weeks, didn't it? But in Australia, nobody got on the roof.
Do you think officers? Do you think there should be that model where officers in the UK have like guns on towers?
I'm not a fan of it. I must be honest. I think the prison service in the UK run extremely well without those needs. And that's proved by the very few amount, because prisoners did escape from prisons in Australia, guns or not. So I'm not a fan of it. It's not something I would instinctively think it would be a good idea. I don't. So even though it wasn't an issue for me when I was there, I just took it for what it was in that country that I was in. And I just accepted it. I never thought about it. I just went, okay, you're off on an escort, carry the pistol. going up on a tower, check the pistols, and crack on with it.
But different environments are following their systems, whereas I guess here, asking that question, it's that kind of why, what's the need?
It's so against our the way we think about firearms in this country is never historically been that way.
I suppose the reality is, if you put from knowing what I know about prisons, from speaking to prison officers, prisoners, and various different members of staff, the actual inside of the prison, having a gun with an officer is only going to escalate or make more problems than reduce them.
Yeah, you never would. When you were on nights, obviously, you had to have 2 of you sitting around. There were 3 of you in the gatehouse. 2 of you had to take a walk out and patrol. They never put officers on the wings during the night.
Yeah.
What they did is they used to unlock a door. I'd hand my weapon, because we both had weapons on night in the grounds, hand that over to the officer. He would lock me into the wing. I would walk around the wing just to make sure everything was quiet. No problems. Come back down, tap on the door, he'd check it was just me and not other things going on, open the door, bring me out and hand me back my weapon. But you have to remember, way back in the time when I was there, prisoners had an intercom system, which we don't tend to have in this country at all. So if they had a problem, because there's no officer on the wing to ring a bell to, they could press the intercom and speak to a member of staff in the gate if they'd got a problem. So there was no
room service.
Well, room service in a way, but it'd say putting officers on wings, because in modern prisons, now don't get me wrong, they may be different in Australia now, because suicide prevention in this country is escalated to a point where you need staff on a wing to keep and monitor those kind of things, and that may be true in Australia. I remember you're talking about nearly 40 years ago now, so they might have had to move on and said, we need to do something different ourselves. But it was always an intercom system and no staff on the wings at night time. That's just the way it was.
Yeah. All right, well, let's come back to actually staffing prisons now. And obviously there's very different sizes of prisons, very different styles, different categories and such. So if we stick with what we know very, very well, Cat B locals, around the region of sort of 300, 350 inmates, so kind of 178 cells-ish, chewing up.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, if take that size jail, because obviously that's going to be slightly different, something like Wrexham or Birmingham, where you've got 2,000, 2,100 kind of prisoners. They're going to need additional staff and assets. So when we start,
it's a ratio. They always work prisons on ratios and security. Depending, the lower the security of the prison, the bigger the ratio of prisoner to staff is, in the sense that there are more prisoners than staff, and the higher the security, the higher the ratio staff to prisoners will be. But you remember also in high security prisons, it's mostly single cell accommodation.
Yeah.
It's lifers, nearly always single cell accommodation. And there are other conditions where they be, even Featherstone, which was a Cat C prison, was built on single cell accommodation and still is.
Well, I think all Victorian prisons were built on single cell accommodation. It was only beyond the Victorian times.
Even the modern ones. Remember, Featherstone was built in 1977. The high security prisons like Long Lartin was built in 1974. Gartree was 1960s, it was built originally. So they were all single cells, they were designed that way. And it's just we've moved away from that slightly, because now we've gone back to twin ups, or 2 ups as they call it. So when you look at places like a brand new prison like Wrexham, they've mostly put 2 people in the cells wherever they can. And I'm not sure whether that's based on cost and or about prisoners' risk. Because if you put 2 people in a cell, basically what you've created there is somebody to look after the other prisoner in a really strange kind of way. If you've got somebody that has got a problem with things like self-harming and or might be looking to harm themselves at some stage, the other person in that cell may be the person that rings that bell and prevents that from happening. So I'm never quite sure, I've got to be honest, about whether it's just about economy and or is there a little bit of stuff going on there where the other prisoner may be there, and that's not the prisoner's responsibility, by the way. Don't get me wrong, I'm not assuming that we should do it because we're making a prisoner be responsible, but by nature they will be.
Let's pick this up.
Reducing the risk.
Reducing the risk. A bit of company as well.
Let's pick this up in episode 6. Because
you did that in 4 words and it took me 3 seconds.
Absolutely. Typical psychologist.
Yeah.
Let's pick that up in a future episode, because we get off point. Let's talk about the power pyramid, as they say, in a very corporate environment. So at the very top of the jail, we've got our governor. Yeah. So obviously above that, we're talking about politicians, so on and so forth. But let's stay inside the walls. So we've got our governor. Below a governor, we have.
Well, you've got governors at different levels, of course. Yeah. Those governors, depending on the security of the prison.
Shall I ask Emma this question, so we get it in 3 words rather than 3 paragraphs?
All right. You've got a different level of governors.
Yeah. So we've got basically deputy governors.
Well, they're called heads of residences now, but yes, you've got deputy governors. You've also got, then the governor grades have their own ranking system, down to what you call the very basic level of governor grade.
But when the governor's not here, because there always has to be a governor grade on effectively around...
A duty governor, yes.
So when the governor's not here, therefore in charge of the jail, it would fall to one of the duty governors, one of the deputy governors.
Yes, it always...
To pick it up.
Yeah.
Then below your governor, your deputy governor levels, you've got what, your senior officers, principal officers?
Oh no, you go into uniforms then, because governors by tradition and history never are not in uniforms.
Okay.
So you'll have now what they call a CM, a custody manager. That's an old name for a principal officer.
Okay. Yeah.
And then you've got supervising officers, which is an old name for senior officers.
So principal officer then sits below that deputy governor officer. Would that be the same as the chief officer back in the day?
No, chief officer is a lost rank, which was above the principal officer.
Oh, okay, cool.
So you had a chief officer in charge of all the staff in uniforms, principals, senior officers. But those terms are not used now. The custody managers, supervisors.
I think I need a piece of paper to write this down. So we've got a governor, then we've got effectively the deputy governor grades. I appreciate they're different names and different establishments and different times. Then we've got our principal officers.
Effectively, all terms, but yes.
And then we would go into our supervisors.
Then you go down to officer grades.
So when you get to your supervisors, are they on the landings?
No, they are like senior officers. Their job is to supervise the staff, really, at the face front. So a senior officer or a supervisor may be in charge of the wing, so therefore in charge of the staff that are on that wing. Okay. Managing the shifts.
So would you then have like a supervisor that maybe is in charge of reception, a supervisor is in charge of A wing, B wing?
Depending on the size and security of the prison.
Kitchens, workshops, education.
Yeah, there'll always be somebody possibly at what they call supervisor level, but they're supervising mostly the staff around them rather than the prisoners. Prisoners are managed by prison officers. Yeah. Then you've got what we used to call senior basic grade officers, so those that have come to the top end of their pay scale, which takes 6 years these days. It used to take 15 years when I joined to get to the top of your pay scale.
The pay scale's a lot smaller now.
Yeah.
I'd imagine that's the
You've got 5 small ones year after year for the first 5 years. Then you had to wait till year 12 for what they call a long service increment, and then you had to wait for 15 years to get your final long service increment, and an extra 5 days annual leave. That's all changed now. It's all done within the 6 years. So you've got sort of those scales, incremental levels for prison officers.
So underneath our supervisors, we get to our officers, which are, like you say, they're the day-to-day managing prisoners, effectively.
Yeah, basically.
Prisoners' behaviour, prisoners' movements.
At whatever department they're in.
I guess below the officers, is that where you have your OSGs?
Operational support grades, their job basically, they might be managing the gate. Yeah. They're not really what they call prisoner-led, but it's not strictly true.
They would escort, like if somebody had to come on from outside, like a roofer that had to look at the lightning.
Vehicles moving around the prison, looking after the gate. But I've known some, in Featherstone, I was more than surprised, they put an officer, an OSG, an operational support grade, in charge of the education department, and it was quite a big education department. And that's not no reflection on that position, but in my personal feeling, that should have been a prison officer role and not an operational support grade. Because what you're doing is you're putting them in charge of many prisoners and managing many prisoners without the relative pay rate to go with that job, because you're giving them responsibility without giving them the position, and I just don't think that's fair. So they are sometimes put upon.
Because they have keys, don't they, OSGs?
They don't have cell keys.
No, but they have
keys for gates to move around the prison.
They have to meet contracts from place to place.
Yeah, so
but they don't have the same level of training. And I've known an OSG, and I knew him relatively well. It was a number of years ago now. And I remember listening to him. It was long before I knew any prison officers. I knew this guy. Yeah. And I remember him telling me about what his job was and the stories and stuff like that. Thankfully, he was in rather a low security prison. Of course, it might be slightly different. But I think about the stuff I hear from you and from other officers and such like the level of training they've had to go through. The OSGs don't go through anywhere near that.
They don't go into training schools the same way as
they're still given keys to be able to wander around the jail by themselves, effectively.
Yes, yeah.
But without the same level of training.
Yeah. Plus the fact they don't have the same level of legal responsibility that a prison officer. Prison officers, once they join, become what they call, you have all the powers of a constable while you're on duty.
Police constable.
Yes, which isn't true for operational support grades. Yeah. They don't have that same authority in the same way.
That's really interesting. I wonder if, because just remembered it. I'd actually forgotten that fact, but I remember when you first told me, and whether people actually realise that when a prison officer is on duty, they have the same. How is it you put it?
It's actually set on your warrant card that you get. Yeah. You have the powers of the Constable, Prisons Act 1953 or 1952, if I remember rightly. No, I must admit, I've been retired for nearly 8 years. Yeah. They may have changed that. I'm not aware that that's been changed. Because when you've got somebody outside your prison walls and something goes on, like an attempted escape, and somebody tries to help somebody escape, you can then have the power of arrest, which is not the same as a citizen's arrest. There's a huge difference between the so if you, and when we used to have possibility like a risk of escape, you could go outside your prison and you can stop cars on the street. You can actually stop cars to search cars if you think a prisoner's escaped.
The power he has, my God, I did not know.
It's under the powers of the and it would have been supervised by a governor level. You don't just wander out in the street and start stopping cars. It's not the same quite.
It's not like a production company where they're like, start, we're filming here.
A police officer has all those powers 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
Whereas prison officers only have it while they're on duty. The minute you step through the doors, you're not being paid.
But
you have none of those powers.
You're on duty, but outside of the prison. So, for example, if you're an escort,
yes,
then you still have those.
Yeah, you have to, because you might have to do something and make a decision based on the security of prisoner escape. So you need to have that higher level of authority to make it stand up in law. That's all.
Okay.
It's weird, but they may have changed that. I've got to be honest. Maybe people listening say that's been changed. Please write in, and I've looked for it and I can't find the changes. But however, but no.
We'll ask the guys at Wrexham next time they're down. We'll have a chat with the guys there and see what they say.
Yeah, it may have been changed, or there might be subtle changes.
The government, in the way they do things, they probably haven't changed it.
Possibly not. Old things are left to die quietly and never get taken off the books.
It's like some of the old laws about having straw in the back of a taxi
cab.
They still exist in law, but they just never be. So they die on the vine, really, don't they? But yeah, somebody said there's still a law you can shoot a Welshman on Sunday if he comes over the Welsh Bridge into England, into Shrewsbury.
Yeah, but you're not allowed to have a gun.
No, it's for 1 hour.
Oh,
I'm going back to the 12th century. There was no guns. Apparently, any Welshman coming over the Welsh Bridge, you can actually shoot them.
I'm going to put this out there right now, just because I just in case, do not go shooting Welsh people on a Sunday on Welsh Bridge with a bow and arrow. In fact, don't shoot Welsh people at all, because you're Welsh.
Yes. It just goes out, these old laws just lie there, and nobody really says, let's get rid of them.
Okay, do you know, and this is one that I think is quite interesting, and I think it's quite important as well. So everything we spoke about to the OSG level, now they're all civil servants.
Yes, yeah.
OSGs, are they civil servants?
Yeah, they're employed by the civil service.
But do they become full civil servants in that sense, or are they employees? Because, and I'll jump slightly to one side, I'm sure we'll get into more details of this, but psychology departments, so where you used to work, you were a civil servant, full benefits and all the conditions that come with it. Yeah. Healthcare used to be exactly the same, education used to be exactly the same, but they've outsourced a lot of that now. So they're not civil servants any longer, they're actually employed by secondary organisations. But with OSGs, were they Securicor guys, or were they like...
No, they are civil servants, they're employed, but it's usually that it can be for many of operational support grades, their first step into becoming a prison officer. So they'll learn a great deal of things just by being in that
like
job.
Being a PCSO effectively to a point.
Yes, in a way, and then step into being, and many do sort of step up into being that prison officer roles. And occasionally, as prison officers decide they may want to retire as they get older, or they just decide that they can't do anymore, there's nothing stopping them applying to do what they call an operational support grade. Yeah. Many officers sometimes retire. And then come back as operational support grades.
I think Steve did that at Gloucester. So Steve, that used to be a tour guide for us at a different prison, was an officer, left for a number of years. I think he was a teacher for a bit, and then went back to Horfield in Bristol, but as an OSG.
Yes.
But he wasn't a civil servant any longer. He was working. I'm sure he wasn't. I'd have to double check. But anyway.
Well, you've got contractual OSG. That's slightly different. They take them up on a 1 day less than an annual contract, and they're there to escort outside workers that come in, like to do building cells, building buildings, knocking buildings down. Outside contractors will be taken by what they call on-contract operational support grades, but their job only lasts for them, I think it's 1 day below 1 year. And I'm pretty sure I'm still right at this, if you take them beyond that 1 year, you have to employ them on a full-time basis. There's a law that says you can take them on a contract, and on the day before their 1 year's up, they can go, thank you very much, your contract's finished.
Yeah.
Then they leave you off for annual leave, or they give you a week off, and then they'll call you back and renew that contract for 12 months. Because by the nature of the people that are coming in and out do their work, when they're finished, you technically don't need that operational support.
So in theory, it's to escort a particular job that's being done.
So I don't think they're actually civil servants in the way we understand, but I'm not sure.
Well, let's come back to that.
Because about pension schemes, you'd be in and out of the
well, let's come back to that in a second. Go into that in more detail as we move to sort of the side roles of prison officers, the less custodial roles, but the rehabilitation such that. I think that one of the things that's always been quite interesting to me, and maybe I pay too much attention to it, is that civil servant piece. Because when you're a civil servant, you're effectively employed by the government. That comes with, from knowing both of you and from knowing other people that have done it and people that haven't done it but also worked in prisons, there's a different level of responsibility. I think there's a different level of positioning. There is obviously a different level of benefits in being a civil servant and not. And I think the Official Secrets Act, for example, is one of those. As a civil servant, you will sign Official Secret Act. As a contractor to a third party, you might have a privacy policy or a confidentiality agreement of some sort, just as we might do in a commercial world, but it won't be the Official Secrets Act in the same way. So there's numerous things. I think the
you probably have different access to very different information and different levels of access as well.
Well, let's contractor always won't be running around reading prisoners' records.
Let's hold that for a minute. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk more about the roles inside prisons
the other bits
and all those other exciting pieces that sit.
Your turn next.
We'll take a quick break.
You are listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Unlock the past and discover what life was like at Shepton Mallet Prison. Relive the history of past prisoners over the last 400 years. Experience what a Victorian prison cell was like for those incarcerated. See where executions were carried out. Walk the landings and prison wings. You'll hear stories of those who worked and lived behind its high walls. See it, touch it, feel it on a journey of discovery at the nation's oldest prison. Visit SheptonMalletPrison.com today to find out more.
You're listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome back. You're listening to Life Behind Bars. We're on episode 3 and we're talking all about prison roles on the right side of the bars. So we've talked a little bit about the structure, the power pyramid, as they say in sort of a corporate world, which I hate that word, but it does shape down like that. And I guess in a prison, it also very much is a authoritarian world?
Hierarchical.
Thank you.
It's strictly hierarchical system.
Yeah, exactly. So that works. It's very much similar to the military, I would guess.
Well, it's based on the military, but not really quite as rigid as the military might be.
But it is stripes and ranks, and
yes.
Yeah. So okay, let's step away then from the sort of the custodial side in the sense of that operation piece, and let's have a look at all the other bits of a jail that go into running it. So, should we start with psychology?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Talk us through a psychology department in terms of how that structures, certainly in your experience.
To be fair, it's changed since I've left. So when I was working for the prison service, it was very much a case of you had your head of psychology and kind of chartered psychologists that oversaw the psychology team, who would be running programs and doing risk assessments. They'd also be doing staff training and different roles like that. Since then, though, it's changed. Psychologists don't tend to do anything in programs. You have what are called facilitators. So people are brought in and trained to deliver programs. That was multidisciplinary when I was working there, but it would be like a psychologist and an officer or who would run the program, or a psychologist and an assistant psychologist who would be like just new into the department without any experience and just there to do kind of more admin and support and learn. Whereas now, yeah, they hire people specifically to run the programs, and then the psychologists will do the supervision, the training, and then the risk assessments and more kind of Yeah, that's it, basically. I'm sure there's something else I could say,
but I need to think of, and I can't think of it quickly enough. And then Graham will be chatting, or you'll be chatting, and then a few minutes later I think of it. I'm like, can I throw it in now? Yeah, no, that's gone.
The question is, are you saying that they're nearly always outside agencies that step in to do what you call the cognitive skills programs now then, rather than internally employed psychologists and staff to do them?
I'm not sure who employs them, but I think so, yes.
Yeah.
So
and would you say that's a better way to do it, or would you prefer to see that it's done by the staff, however they come, whether they're psychologists, assistants, prison officers, or other agencies that work in the staff? I don't know. I know what I think about what I think might be more useful to me, but...
Because I don't know how it's set up exactly, I'm not sure. I think that it's useful that people that are working with the prisoners get to know the prisoners, because then you can get a full picture.
Yeah.
So in my experience, it was useful to know a prisoner and know more than just those 2 hours that you see them. But I guess the facilitators don't do any of the risk assessment side of it. They literally deliver the programme, and then the psychologist will use that information to then make assessments along with the other kind of assessments they do in terms of actual need and risk management. So I guess it depends on the individual roles, but I do think you need to know the prisoners that you're working with and doing assessments on.
I've always seen a slight disadvantage in a group of people stepping in, doing something and stepping out.
Yeah.
And then literally switching off from that and probably stepping into somebody else's programme somewhere else on a continual basis. Whereas when I was part of that cog skills team, or the ETS as they used to be called, I think it's called TSPs now, thinking skills programmes, I had that permanent connection with the prisoners. Because not only was I delivering these things in the morning, I was going up onto the landings or other places like visits or wherever I was going to work in the prison, and I would still be communicating with those people. So I had the chance to observe sometimes the things that we've gone through when prisoners are asked to go out. It's not homework as such, but you'd ask them to go out and think about how they might manage something in a different way up on the landing, particularly if you're dealing with things like anger management. I had that chance not only to be able to observe that behaviour, but also be able to perhaps go along and nudge it along in a real world rather than just walking away. It feeds back the
other way as well in terms of when you're in group being able to challenge things that are being said and being seen.
Yes.
And things like that.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly where the facilitator's role begins and ends. That information is definitely useful in terms of the psychology point of view. I guess as long as you have all of that information from those different departments, we would always go around and talk to officers.
Yes.
We would talk to their... what's it called? Like in nurseries, you have your key worker.
They used to call them personnel officers.
That's the word I was looking for.
They change their names all the time.
We would go and talk to people. We talked to the different departments that they were in.
But you were also working in the prison full time too.
Yes.
Which means you still had a connection. I'm talking about people that step in from the outside and then step back out. And unless there's huge communication when they come back in to what's happened within that prison environment, to be able to look at that group and say, okay, then right, we need to address something here, because people really don't come and volunteer.
As well as those facilitators that come in and run the programmes, I don't know how the psychology department are employed now either, whether they're still civil servants or whether they're kind of an umbrella that are then brought in to deliver that.
Because one of the differences
to point out is that when you're the prisons that you guys are talking about here are relatively small prisons in the sense of, we're talking about sort of a maximum of 350 inmates, so therefore staffing wise you're probably talking somewhere in the region of maybe 110 staff.
Depends who you talk about, civilians and everybody.
Well, I'm talking about all the staff.
You're probably looking at very nearly an equal amount of staff would work in a prison to the amount of prisoners you got. Wouldn't be unusual to employ 300 people in here.
Yeah, so therefore, what you're talking about is actually not a massive workforce, but if you multiply that to 2,100 prisoners in somewhere like Berwyn or something like that, then suddenly you're probably talking about 1,500 staff. That's a very different position for a psychologist to be able to, because when you were in a prison, I'm sure that you probably recognised most of the officers and knew most of their names and could have conversations, but with 1,500 staff, that's not...
Beyond communicating with the individual staff, I think, personally, in my own opinion, I think when you get to those number of prisoners and ratios, I think it's really difficult to gather decent information anyway, because how can the staff know all those prisoners?
But they do it in schools. That's exactly how schools work.
But they don't necessarily know the individual children, do they? They don't.
Well, the teachers will know the
Well,
individual
I
children.
would have thought teachers, what they do is they have a year group, don't they? So you're going to have a teacher say, I get the same 30 children every day for this lesson.
Yeah.
And then,
So
then your history, your English, your maths, and then I'll see them again in 2 days'
Does that
time.
happen with the psychologist role, in the sense if you have the same 30 prisoners in group, for example, I don't know how I did that, in the same 30 prisoners in group, that you'll see every group session for that same time every week for a period
But
of
that teacher doesn't come in and teach a lesson and then go home and come back. They're still in the environment, so they still see the children at playtime and at meal times and around about all those times, so the connection is still there.
Yeah, but that's exactly the same in...
I wasn't necessarily...
Oh, I see what you're saying. So you're saying whereas the teacher might go off and then see those kids again somewhere else in the school, whereas the psychologist will go back off to their department, sit down, drink their tea and their coffee.
No, I'm not talking about the psychologist here either. I'm talking about across the board. I'm not talking about... Because the psychologist can gather information from the people that are working with the prisoners, that's not a problem. But if the people that are working with the prisoners don't necessarily know them very well because there's too much turnover in terms of prisoners, staff and the sheer number, then the information that they're collecting...
I can tell you from...
Maybe there's a difference. It's about the turnover, because in school you start and you're there for 5 years. Your sentence is... I can't believe I just said that. Your sentence in school is 5 years, for example, whereas actually your prison sentence might be 5 months. Or 5 years. Or
and even if it's 5 years, you can be moved.
Yeah, I was going to say...
To pick up the point that Emma said about information, you're quite right. But I can guarantee you, in my experience, right, one of the things that officers probably struggle with the most is when they're being asked to deliver quite detailed reports on something that you need to know to write a report. Because the officer say, I ain't got time to sit down. There's no time built in for an officer to sit and spend an hour to write a reasonably detailed report about that prisoner's attitude, behaviour, improvements, non-improvements, to pass to you. They're too busy. They just don't have that time. So the system really is, it's not working properly. So when you create things like a personal officer, that was meant to say that I've got 10 or 15 prisoners that would belong to me in that sense, that they were part of them, and I was meant to make those connections. But that's not possible to do in a prison system. There's never enough staff, there's never enough time, so you tend not to. So when you come to me and go, could you write me a bit of a report up, Graham, by email, whatever, and I'll be going, yeah, okay. And then you'll be asking me a week later and a week later, and then sometimes... Am I right or wrong? Am I right or wrong?
It was frustrating trying to get information.
Yeah, and I'm going to be absolutely honest here. Officers generally are not trained to write those kind of what you call reports that are based on your what you see and what you know. Rather, we do reports based on facts.
Something that used to frustrate me as well, so back to the second, is...
Oh, I will re-ask my question.
I know you will. With things like that, obviously the system's changed in terms of my role, so I don't know exactly how that works now, but one of the things that we used to find frustrating when we would go to speak to different departments, it wasn't just officers, it was the educational department or works departments and stuff like that. They're not obviously trained in risk in risk assessment. However, we would try and we delivered staff training whilst I was there, where we would try and teach people what sorts of things to look out for and why it was important to us. And the amount of people that would just dismiss that and be like, well, that's not my job, I'm only here to teach. It's like, well, yeah, but you're not, because you're here to teach prisoners, and part of their sentence is proving that they are safe in the community. So therefore your role has to incorporate that level of thinking. But people would dismiss it and be like, nah, and yes,
I haven't got time, or I can't be bothered, I don't know what to do.
There's two things there, let's try and pick them up individually. One is that, from what I understand there, and this won't be everybody, so it's not a sweeping statement, there are definitely people that work in prisons that really don't care about rehabilitation. And if you watched or listened to episode 1, where we talked about prisons and why we have them, we talked a lot about rehabilitation. So there's people that actually work in here managing prisoners, whether it's behaviour, whether it's their education, whatever it might be. Specifically, if it's an education or in psychology, that is surely the two key pieces of rehabilitation, the two larger pieces. And therefore, there might be people working those roles that don't actually really care about that. So it's not going to have an effect. But my real question...
That's true in any job, though, isn't it?
Well, it is, but it is. The difference is, I guess, depending on what jobs you're doing, is that we have prisons for a very, very specific reason. Whereas, it might be the same in schools, but other jobs that you might have, let's say, for example, I'm trying to find a good example in my head, but you know, if you work in a supermarket and you stack the shelves and you're not really that bothered whether the label of baked beans faces the front or faces the back, because you just don't care. Now it should face the front because people see it and they recognise it. There's two reasons why. One is because the companies spend Heinz sponsorship. Heinz spend millions of pounds on marketing, so they want their brand, the best front-facing, right in your face.
And right in the proper shelf.
Exactly, and at the right eye level and stuff like that. So that's what they pay for in the supermarkets, and that's the deals that they do. So if you then have a member of staff that just doesn't put it right because they don't care, the knock-on effect eventually might be that Heinz sell less beans, therefore they charge more to the supermarket, they pull the contract, or more likely the supermarket goes, well, we don't sell a lot of that. So we'll move that and we'll put something else in. Now, it might not be because of the product or anything like that. It's because one person hasn't seen...
Can't be bothered.
Yeah, because they don't care for whatever reason. Now, that all comes back down to culture and training. So when we bring that back to the prison service and we look at this power pyramid, where is it that this falls down? Because somewhere in this world, in this big triangular world, somewhere the culture and the training has fallen down. And you've just both alluded to exactly the problems from both ends. You don't necessarily get the reports. Officers don't necessarily have the time for the reports, or education don't have the time for the reports, but you're not getting reports because at the end of the day, it's the psychologists that make the recommendations to the parole board for release or for changing of sentences, for example, or for lower categorisation of prisoners. It's the psychologists that have not control, but they have an influence to be able to say, this person should do that. If they're not getting the information through, that prisoner potentially is not getting the opportunity they should get because somebody somewhere can't be bothered. But where's that going on?Ho is that person responsible for that?
Well, you'd like to think that you'd say that it must be a government's responsibility because they're in charge of the whole ethics and style of the prison.
They don't run the prison, though.
No, they don't. But they can set the conditions for training. They can get it for recruitment.
No, the governor can do that. The governor can push that in the same way as I would have thought their headmaster can push back, because the government set policy, they set law, they set a budget, and in the olden days, we know that obviously prisons used to work in the sense that the governor was given a budget to run the prison. There's £10,000, run your prison. Yeah. If you don't spend it, you're still going to get it. And the governor will be like, cool, we're going to spend 8,000, we've got 2,000.
I think that world's changed. If you don't spend it, you take it off.
Long time ago, yeah. Obviously, we're talking Georgian prison times. But now you still have a budget, as you say. If you don't spend it, they take it off you. Now, somewhere in this hierarchy must have the ability for someone to go, this bit's broken, and this is how we fix it.
Well, communication is the art of everything at the end of the day, isn't it? The trouble with many professions inside the prison service and out, we tend to decompartmentalise skills. So what we'll say is you've got that group are educational, and your job is education. Yeah. And it's either English, maths or cooking, that's what you do. Yeah. And there you go, psychologist, that's your part there. Yeah. And then you go to the healthcare, that's what you're responsible for, and then prison officers respond for that, and OSGs respond for that, and outside it, that's all you're going to do. The danger with that is, I always think, when you split your skills right down, that's where your communication, if it's not absolutely brilliant and resourced properly, will fall apart with a weak link very, very quickly. I've always been a massive, massive fan of multi-skilling people. So when you multi-skill people, even if they don't actually get involved with the piece of work you do, they all have an understanding of why it is there and the importance of why it's there in the first place.
But that's not multi-skilling, that's culture. That's two different things.
But even to a point, remember, I was multi-skilled because I ended up doing cognitive skills programs, which are based on psychology.
Oh, absolutely.
And I thought it was wonderful. It gave me skills that I never knew I had before. Yeah. Not just in that room, but up there on those landings.
I think that, that there was elements of trying to improve that, which is why we created and then tried to train different departments in terms of what information we wanted, just so that we could improve the communication side of it, because their role isn't the same as ours. Their role was to teach English or maths or whatever subject they were there.
Remember, teachers are employed in private level.
They are. They're not even employed.
It's either a college. I think Manchester College took a great big chunk of the country.
Which makes sense.
So they pay them privately to come in and do that job.
Which does make sense to a point, because the prison service do not have a training program to train teachers. There are training programs externally, in other words. So you bring them in.
Exactly.
We had a situation once. We were doing a review, and the person from the education was asked to sit on the review, and they refused point blank on the grounds it wasn't part of their contract. Their contract is with Manchester College, and it doesn't say that in the college that I have to sit on your reviews. So are you going to?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
You know?
I think there was elements, and obviously things may well have changed as well, because the role of the psychologist has changed since I've worked for the prison service.
But prisons, I think we would probably agree loosely, are getting worse. We're locking more people up for longer for variations of crimes. Then prisons, I don't think we're saying are getting better.
No, I wasn't saying that prisons were getting better. I was just saying in terms of what the psychologist needs in terms of their role. I don't know where that sits at the moment.
But what I mean is the change that we're talking about is not improving prisons. And when I come back to it, I know I bring it back to different businesses because it's how my brain works, but when we talk about multi-skilled people, and I'm all for multi-skilled, I think the more people are multi-skilled, absolutely the better, because you understand different roles. The reality is you scale any organisation, any structure, and the prison service is on the scale. It's a big, big scale. When you talk about it countrywide, nationally, it's a huge employer. Talk about a jail with prison officers, it might have 150 prison officers. You talk about prison officers around the country, you're into tens of thousands.
Yeah,
and you're going to do the same with the other departments. If you take a massive company, something like Apple, I've got my Mac here, you're going to have people that just specialise in just one piece of software, or just in processors, or just in that tiny little piece of the chip, or there's people that specialise just in how, the colouring of it, the shaping of it, the styling of it, how the keys are, how they click, do they make sound, do they not make sound, the lighting behind it, every single little aspect. So you'll have huge teams, and eventually they'll all go up, and there'll be different department heads that communicate, but the one thing that Apple, I believe, tend to get right is the culture and the belief and the understanding, that mission, that single vision and mission of what we're trying to do. And the prison service doesn't have that. And that's why I think...
But in Apple,
culture,
that absolutely wonderful person that's doing that work will not be sitting there in isolation going, this is my secret, and you pay for it. They will be helping the others to learn those secrets, because Apple quite rightly go, we need to move on.
Yeah, because it's a culture.
We recognise that person might leave.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we don't want, so that's the culture about sharing information, sharing skills and sharing talent. And that's not easy to do.
You would be exactly the same, because I would say, and I know you obviously did it for varying reasons, but when they closed the prison you worked at, Shrewsbury, when they closed the prison, I know you went part-time at another jail, but that's a huge loss for the prison service. But nobody will have seen that.
No.
But that's a massive loss for the prison service. It was my gain, because when you came to work for me in the prison, you developed an amazing prison tool that we still use 7 years down the line. We've taught many, many other people to deliver it. It's an amazing tool. So that was the prison's loss, but they didn't recognise that. And that's what I'm saying, is we talked in episode 1 about rehabilitation, because ultimately prisons have, we came back down to 4 key reasons. I know there's more. We talked about prevention, so that's fine, we lock them up. Talked about deterrence, it doesn't really work, but yeah. We talked about punishment, so we get that in terms of being removed, but the key one was rehabilitation. And currently, the entire system seems to be broken, and there's not rehabilitation. But actually, I question whether it's a huge break, or whether it's just somebody, probably very much at the top, I'm going to get in trouble with governors here, but somebody very much at the top that is just not ensuring that the culture and the mission and the vision of what we're trying to do in prisons isn't being pushed. I'm trying to establish, is that governors, or is that government, or is it somewhere lower?
I was going to say, I think that question there is what I was going to ask, pretty much, in the sense that
I beat you to it.
The culture of the criminal justice system, the approach, it changes all the time. The government only ever looking at future elections, so therefore they're not looking at long-term solutions that really improve things for the people, because they're more worried about keeping their seats and might be very sweeping the statement there, but they always seem to be doing things to get things.
Governors and all prisons have to follow the rules and regulations that are laid down in Parliament. Simple as that.
I do think there's a place for someone within the prison service, however, to be going, actually, this is the culture that we want to have here, and this is the attitude that we want the people that are working in this establishment
that's
to
what
have.
Norway must have done something similar to that. They must have gone.
One of the problems of the prison service generally is that people forget they're highly complex places. We make assumptions that people come in and this happens to them and they go behind doors and then they come out and they do that and whatever. They're really highly complex places all the time. And the trouble is, when you hand this job to the prison's minister, it's such a difficult job to manage. It's like the poison chalice to them. So there's a danger they may take the easy route, and that's being a populist minister about punishment, Prison works. John Howard said this years ago, way back in the late 80s, early 90s, prison works. And it didn't.
Yeah.
Because they locked up from 40,000 up to 60,000 very quickly. And then they brought out another law in 1992 to get prisoners out much earlier because they said we got too many prisoners in jail. And they brought it back down to 40,000. But because they changed the sentence in a certain way, it resulted in far more of them coming back a lot more often because of the way they operated the license system that went behind it. And then we pushed our way right up to 85,000 prisoners. Dropped a bit in COVID for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Now we're climbing back up again. The government have already made provisions for 98,000 prisoners by the end of 2026. But we're moving away from the subject about who works in prisons.
Well, we are, and we've come on to the white program. Let me just ask you this very quickly, because I think that there are people that, you've just absolutely said it, that influence and have direct influence and direct responsibility for how prisoners run. But we're not talking about those guys, but I'm going to ask you this question. Is the civil servants above, outside of the walls, that work in the prison service and the MOJ, but they work outside the walls, so therefore they're in Parliament, they're making decisions, they're saying to the ministers, this is what we should be doing, they're the ones that provide the advice, the guidance, the lines, the MP is effectively the person that puts it out there and says, this is what we're going to do, takes the flag and takes the cross. How many times have you two in your careers seen either the Minister of Prisons or the civil servants that sit below them, but outside the walls, come in and speak with staff, or speak with prisoners, or inspect it, or wander around and look at it and actually see that day to day?
It happens occasionally. One of the problems with ministers, they don't do what you call unannounced visits very often.
If I ask you of your career...
So when they always announce a visit, the trouble with that is that the prison then, believe it or not, they start setting about making the prison look really presentable.
Of course. I'm not talking about... What I'm saying is, if you think back over the last decade that you were a prison officer, and if you think back over the time you were in prison seconds, how many times can you recall those visits happening?
I can't remember any minister walking around this jail in 25 years. There have been other people around.
Can you remember?
I can't remember any, no.
Right, I'm going to interrupt. I'm sorry. I'm going to jump in there because I think that is the crux of it. That you can't remember it in 25 years.
It does happen, but it may not happen all the time.
But and you can't remember it in the years that you spent in jail, which I know is shorter than 25 years. And I think that's part of the problem. We're going to take a very quick break, and then we will come right back and we'll get straight back into that. And also, I've got a brilliant question I want to ask you, and I promise it's not closed, so we'll take a quick break.
I just wanted to...
Back. Hold on. You've got to wait for us to come back. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll be right back.
You are listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome to Shrewsbury Prison, Shropshire's #1 tourist destination. Step behind the gates of this 200-year-old prison and discover an unknown world. Heritage tours run by ex-officers, where you can see the cells, walk the landings, see and touch the history. But there's so much more going on. Experience one of our brilliant activities or take part in our world-renowned events. From escape rooms to axe throwing, overnight sleepovers to prison break, we do it all. And there's something for all the family, with activities starting from 8 years, events from 12 years, and heritage tours for all ages. Visit our restaurant and experience food behind bars. There really is so much to see, do and discover on a day out at Shrewsbury Prison. Visit us at www.shrewsburyprison.com.
You're listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.
Welcome back. You're listening to Life Behind Bars. We're in episode 3. We're talking about the roles within the prison on the right side of the bars. We've got a little bit kind of off point into kind of where prison's gone wrong, but I think it's quite an important place. And you were just saying in the break that...
I don't remember the minister, but we had the Director Generals who were in charge of the prison service underneath the minister. And we've had one of them particularly come in. I remember it from many years ago. I won't even name the person, but it was quite a long time ago. But he came in and I thought, that's good. He's coming to have a look around. But basically he came in and sat down. And what he was trying to say to us was, you need to do this, that and that, because if you don't, we'll close you down or privatise you. So that was great for motivation, wasn't it? Rather than coming and going, guys, I think you're doing a really, really wonderful job here, and my job is to support that the best way I can. That's not what he said. He said, this is what's going to happen. We need to make changes, because if you don't, we'll close you down and or we'll privatise you.
I think it often feels that, and this isn't just about prison staff, I think this goes much broader than that, the people high up within the government that have an influence over what's going on, it often feels like they don't actually know what it's like in real life. On that ground level, what's actually needed, what actually would work.
You could say that for every ministerial department.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. It's across the board coming out of prisons. And the trouble with that is that then rubs off on the general population as well. What's the point? And with things like the prison service, bringing us back into the roles, if someone's job is to teach a particular subject, there's nothing about what their attitude towards criminal justice is about. Whereas if we had a more ingrained culture in the country in general about rehabilitation, about how that should work and about supporting change, then that would come across in the communication between departments within the prison service as it would in any other company, because people would be working together rather than this constant segmented kind of approach, because culture in the country in general is so divided that people aren't working towards one vision. And if you're not working towards one vision, then you're always going to have hops.
You spear off, and it is.
I think we're going to discuss it at a later series about how we in other countries manage, and that will be based on their cultures, of course. But so that will be quite interesting to look at that. I'd like to say something too. We've been talking about different people, and I'm going to mention it and give a shout out to them. I think it's really fair that they do. Administration staff that work inside prison. We tend to forget them, and we see them as not part of the process because they're not prisoner-led at all. Yet without them, a prison would probably collapse very, very quickly. Somebody has to do sentence calculations. When you do things like when a prisoner comes to jail with sentence calculations, there's a process they go through because they're automatically entitled to this and that bit, depending on the sentence they've been given. Somebody has to calculate all that. There's so many people that have to set up all the phone numbers on the phone system that prisoners can actually make. Somebody has to censor all the mail and deal with any cash that's coming in. Somebody has to deal with all the escorts that are set up around the place and prisoners moving from A to B. Used to be done very much by prison officers, but that's become an administration job because, remember, these things are happening all the time. People are going to court, people are going to hospitals, people are going out, people are being transferred.
They've still got lives and things that are happening every day.
There's staff that have to deal with, does a prisoner go out, are they homeless? Who sets up all the money that a prisoner goes out with has to be dealt with by the admin staff to get it all ready every day, all the time. Are they entitled to what they call discharge grant? Because some prisoners are entitled to a discharge grant. Are they going out to a halfway house? Who has communicated this information between these groups? Outside probation, sometimes have permanent probation staff inside. And then there's people coming in to do the work, like what they call job seekers. We used to have somebody permanent here helping prisoners how to look for jobs before they stepped outside the door. But they're actually employed by the Department of Work and Pensions, or whoever does unemployment, work and pensions, rather than the prison service. So I think sometimes there's all kinds of outside agencies that step through these doors every day who all have a valuable place to part. It's really a big machine, and every one of us is a relatively tiny cog in a very big chain.
Because
you break one cog, you break the wheel.
Because you have your own internal HR as well, don't you? Your own internal pay,
human resources.
So all of that's done individually for each prison, as opposed to going to one massive.
Pay systems are run at a national level now. They are for us. I can't talk about civilians, but
I think that I don't know about civilians. But
I think it's automatic.
There would be people that you could approach in site, but they would be the link between you and a central team. But even the training of staff, there's all the administration for the staff as well, in terms of people organising hotels, travel, training, cars, and everything to make sure that people are in a position to do their job as well.
Going into the training schools, come out with the training schools, who orders all the uniforms that you wear, and that may not be done within the prison, because it's automatic for prison officers with uniforms. You're entitled to so many per year. And then every fourth year you're entitled to a big woolly jumper or something like that. Well, not as not as money as it used to be. But all that has to be dealt with by somebody. It's all got to be delivered and come out the set. And then you've got the drivers that bring in. It's really, really quite a complex.
You've also got the actual getting people started, because that whole process of signing National Secrets Act, making sure that the security checks.
Yeah, the induction.
And I think it was probably 5 weeks, 6 weeks. I don't know. It was quite a long time between you've got the job and actually being able to walk through the doors and be given a set of keys.
Did you get paid in between that time?
Stuff like that.
5 weeks if
like,
you've got the job, your start date is
your start date
isn't necessarily walk through the door.
If you've got 50 or 60,000 people that work within the prison walls themselves as admin staff and all the other jobs that go on, including prison officers and all that, you've probably got an equal number that work outside the doors, based in administration throughout the civil service as we get back to the top.
And as I say, there's within psychology, I don't know who employs them, to be fair, but you've also got kind of the research side of it as well, and development in terms of programs and risk assessments, and it all feeds through. And that can be the same for other departments, because there's obviously healthcare and carrots and education.
Somebody has to maintain the computer systems that they use.
I'm coming on to it, because again, carrots you just picked up, which is the drugs team, but those would also potentially, or it might have another role and do that as an additional role, separate role.
What's that? Carrots are normally, well, in Shrewsbury they were outside agencies coming in specifically to do that piece of work.
Yeah.
And they might do
carrots,
2 or 3 days a week.
Carrots, for people aren't aware, are...
Yeah. Sorry?
The carrots are, for people that aren't aware, carrots...
It was the
We're not talking about carrots and sticks.
Around
I can't remember what it stands. Was it care and resettlement and treatment something? Or I might be completely wrong.
I can't remember what it stood for, but it was around alcohol and drug support.
You talk amongst yourselves.
But over the years they changed, because they involved prison officers a lot more in what you call those outside work. They did make an effort, because initially they started with a thing called the SWIP officer, shared working in prisons, and they linked up with probation. So the officers on the inside were meant to work in tandem with the probation staff outside and inside, looking at how we deal with prisoners and getting them ready for release, rather than just being...
Whole systems were put in place when I was there, in terms of improving that communication ready for release as well, so that everybody had access to the same database of the information. It didn't work.
It's counselling, assessment, referral, advice, and through care.
I can remember counselling. That was the only word.
And obviously it was so let me come back to our actual point, which was prison roles. So we've spoken about governors, we've spoken about the uniform grades and then the uniform roles, and I know we've only touched, so we haven't delved into anything really in terms of what an officer does or all these individuals do. We're just talking very much high level at the moment, and maybe down the line we'll delve into some of this in a bit more detail if that's what people want to listen to and hear. We've talked about psychology departments, we've talked about a little bit about education, but really again we've just touched on it. You've picked up on the admin staff, we've spoken about a little bit about politicians, we've probably given them far too much time, and the civil servants outside the walls. We've spoken about some of the non-uniform staff. You're talking about IT and obviously those systems that have to work in the firewall process. Oh my God. We talked very tiny little bit about healthcare. Maybe we should just touch on that. Well, one thing we didn't talk about so far is the works department.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now that's changed too, because when I joined the service, works department, in as much that those that go around maintaining the prison buildings, were used to be known as trade officers, and technically you couldn't get a job unless you'd got an apprenticeship, a proper skill. So you'd be coming in, you've got your plumbers and your electricians, and you've got your chippies, your woodworkers, and you used to have your kitchen staff member. These are classified as works officers running the kitchens. They were all prison officers. Even though they were trades officers and used to wear the old brown jumpsuit as it was, they were still prison officers. Then that changed later on, and they stopped being trade officers, and they're mostly civilian staff now. So they civilianised all that. They still do the same piece of important work.
People that work in the gym, they're personal trainers, gym instructors.
Yes, but they're gyms are prison officers, where they can be called in to work on landings and go to riots. Trades officers are not trade. Civilian trade officers these days will not be called to riots, because they don't have that power and authority to do that. They're not prison officers, but they still do just as equally important work. And they maintain buildings, particularly in old buildings like this, which takes a huge amount of ongoing thing. I remember when we put the toilets in this prison, and we kept the prison open while we were doing it. We just literally emptied 2 columns on the wing and reduced our numbers by 16, and they just punched the holes. You imagine the noise and the work, and you're limited to what you can do in a prison, because you can't just keep working with prisoners all running around you, with the machines and the tools you've got, everything is... So in any 8-hour day, you're lucky to physically get through about 4 hours of work. In any 8-hour day, not for the works department wandering around doing the id bits. I'm talking about major things in prison. When you're building buildings and doing that, they go, you've got to stop. You can't do that until the prisoners have all gone to the workshops and we've got all the other prisoners secured.
And they're listed as well, a lot of all the Victorian prisons.
Yeah, 2.5 hours time they go, stop work. Why? Because all the prisoners are coming back now to come on the wing to get meals. You can't do anything over lunchtime. That can be 2.5 hours lost. So then they'll say, okay, wait till the prisoners have all gone back to work, and that takes another 20 odd minutes. So you might not actually start something till 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you stopped at 12. And then you've got to stop at 4 or quarter past 4, because they all got to come back. And all those tools have to be secured every single time you do that, locked away.
I was going to say that, and with certain roles that they did, they'd be managing prisons as well, because they'd have trusted prisoners that could work with them, who would then be being, like, they'd be learning skills whilst they're doing it, ready for going out. So trusted prisoners would be able
Some
to
of those men I remember coming into prison were already
Mm-hmm.
skilled people as prisoners, whatever reason they come in for. It might have been some of those stuff where they got a regular job and they've just got the small, what I call the low-level crimes, bought to jail, might have had a bit of a punch-up outside the pub or something like that. They'd come in. The first people you would employ would be those people, because they've got the skills already, particularly in our kitchen, because we used to butcher our own meat and make our own sausages. Oh, I used to work up at ADT, as it used to be called, which is a big mass-producing place. Oh, okay, in the kitchen, lad. Why?
Well, we're going to talk about like prisoners down the line, so we won't get too much into that. But I think it's worth mentioning, because I see that side of it probably more than anything else. Because from owning a jail, I see obviously the condition it's in. I see all the things that happen as we're developing it. I get to unpick all these bits, so I get to actually spend probably more time with the works department and what they used to do. And we find lovely bits of graffiti in different places that prisoners and the works department have sort of snuck in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, let me ask you this. So getting towards the end. Which is the most important role or function within a prison?
Which is the most important function?
Role or function, yeah.
Well, that is not an easy question.
And not a closed one, might I add. See how I'm learning sales psychology?
Everything's linked at the end of the day. But if you take a look at it from a uniforms grade, they go, the most important thing for us is that prisoners are actually all in these prison cells at night time and nobody's running away.
I was going to say, when you look at the 4 points from the first episode, in terms of like, well, if you talk about protecting the public, then you want to be talking about your officers securing people. But if you're talking
so you might say to me, what's my prime thing, because that's the thing they'll pull me up on, are everybody where they should be, and are they all there at the end of the day, and are they all still there in the morning? They go, that's what they'll come to me. They won't go to you for that.
No. Whereas from my point of view, it would have been, I would need that communication between various different departments, because I could be signing my name to progress a prisoner, so therefore I want to know that the
you might be signing your name and you're gone.
Yeah, I want to be knowing that.
Let me ask it in a different way. Well, it's a different question. Which is the least important piece? Which piece could you go, we can get rid of that?
None of it. Not in my experience.
Okay.
There may be some that we see as less value, and if they didn't happen at that moment in time, it wouldn't be the end of the world. So there will be things in a prison that go, that's been missed. It's not the end of the world. We'll get to it later on, or we can scrub around it and do. But there are other jobs that have to be done right there at that place in time. So, but they're all there. I don't believe the prison service for 1 second ever employs anybody that's not necessary. This is not a business that just employs people to give them a job. It isn't. And that's sometimes councils have been accused of that, and many public services are accused of employing people for no particular benefit.
There's a lot of bureaucracy and red tape, and I think that's probably where the confusion comes. I agree, you're almost certainly right that there aren't, because the budgets are so tight, there aren't people that are employed that aren't needed. It's the bureaucracy of getting them to that role, the cost, the red tape you have to go through, which is probably excessive. And also, actually, have you got the right people in the right roles? But back to that point, my belief is, I think the reason why prisons fail, regardless of whose fault it is the culture. If you wandered around a prison today, pick any prison, you wandered around and you asked 10 random staff.
You talk about the country's culture or the prison culture, because they're
the same. They should be the same. They should be exactly the same, because as we spoke about before, what happens in society is a reflection of what happens in jail. But if you go into any prison, anywhere in the country, you pick 10 random staff and you ask them, what is the mission or the vision of our prison system? You'll probably get some what are you talking about? I've got no idea. And you'll get a a number of different answers.
You'll get 10 different answers.
Whereas if you walk into any really big, strong, well-built, branded business, and you ask the same question to 10 employees, you'll get the same answer.
Yeah, probably not at 10 times you'll get that answer.
Yeah.
You'll always get the one that says, I'm just here for the money.
Yeah, of course you will. Of course you will.
That's the
but they
nature.
still will understand. That's their individual.
Which, by the way, folks, you know that I'm not here for the money.
Yeah, that's their individual
just impossible.
vision and mission.
Yeah.
But the overall picture.
The organisational culture.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's a big difference between massive ones and small ones. And regardless of whether it's a business or not a business, by the by, the bottom line is that the prison service is a huge organisation.
Oh.
Any huge organisation needs that
Hundreds of thousands.
to make it work. Yeah, exactly.
Purely for that side, remember the criminal justice system is massive.
Oh, yeah.
Prisons alone eat up hundreds of thousands of staffing levels. Then I know the police do, because we all forget, we all think everybody stands in uniform. There's a massive team of civilians sitting behind police forces. And then there's...
Okay.
The courts
I'm going to put it to an end.
There's so much more to it. You've got
I'm going to
the
put it
courts
to an
and
end,
yes,
otherwise
courts.
we'll be into. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Do ask us any questions, send us your comments, any subjects you'd like us to speak about, anything you thought we got right or we thought we got wrong, any questions for these guys, do send them over. Join us for next week's episode where we're talking about prison sentences. We're going to talk about the different types of crimes, the different types of punishments you can get, the prison sentences and their limitations. No doubt we'll go off on a slight tangent. It's kind of what we do. But until then, it's goodbye from me. It's goodbye from them.
Goodbye.
Right.
And we'll see you on our next episode.
Look forward to it.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Life Behind Bars, produced and created by 50mm Media.